boy. Double click a Glock, make them diddy bop, boy.
Nigga, we be busting up the ops on the regular. Nigga, we be ducking from the cops on the regular.
I have a business proposition for everyone here right now. All you have to do is have a child between the ages of, let's say, 10 and 14, and a willingness to completely and irreparably damage their future by getting them invested in politics way, way too early. And then what I can do in return is give you a mildly successful internet podcast. How does that sound? Conservative influencers perplex me. They really do. Because in my head, the term influencer and then conservative are sort of at odds, you know? That doesn't really seem like a thing that traditional conservatives would buy into, but nevertheless, they exist. Most conservative influencers market themselves on the same thing. They all want to bring common sense back to American dialogue, you know? They're anti-woke, anti-bullshit. Oh, fuck, this video is about kids. I don't know if I can swear. Okay, we're gonna anyway. What they want to do, essentially, is they want to bring common sense back to America to combat the woke mind virus. For the record, when I'm talking about these accounts, I'm not talking around the scope of semi-professional to professional political pundits, the a la Matt Walsh, Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, that are all career commentators. I'm talking about the people that just simply have an iPhone and get online to talk about their views. So that's the distinction. These people are influencers, first and foremost. And a lot of them are obtuse, deliberately, because that's part of their brand, is that they engage in rage baiting on social media, and that drives up attention. It gets you to send it to your friends, and that's how their information spreads. You very rarely see conservative influencers talk about economic issues or issues of legislation. They all tend to engage in the same culture war content, because that is what drives up views on their account the most. All of them are basically one and the same in their political views. Very pro-Trump, very pro-MAGA, very anti-woke, very anti-Democrat, something that we've seen 100 times before, but now they have a super loud platform to vocalize these things. So yeah, as I said, the MAGA influencer, the anti-woke influencer is nothing new, but think back to the business deal that I offered you at the start.
Today, we are going to be grading Trump with a report card.
That's right, one of these accounts, by the name of GSD Nation, is run by children. And not in the derogatory sense, by the way. I mean it literally. 50% of their staff is children. Their About section on their website is one of the funniest things that you have ever laid eyes on, because under the pictures of these 12, 14-year-old children are titles like editing director and entertainment director. Hey, whatever you gotta do to get your resume padded, am I right? I talked about rage bait earlier, but this naturally skyrockets engagement because people are perplexed at seeing classic MAGA talking points being parroted to them by literal middle schoolers. And a lot of that engagement comes from worry, because I think people are reasonably concerned about puppeteering your children out for your own political gain. This isn't even the only account that uses age as a hook. There's one called Granny Bibbins, who makes like common sense, make sense common again content. But she's at the other end of the spectrum, where she uses her age as the hook to drag people in. There's been many videos about GSD Nation specifically because of the nature of their content and the fact that their children are involved in making such content. A lot of people engage with this, and GSD does respond to a good nature of them, but for all intensive purposes, the critiques that end up being lobbied at them amount to empty air. A lot of the response videos, especially Saji Sharma's video, focus on the actual aspect of using your kids for political gain and the indoctrination that will happen behind the scenes. And those critiques are without a doubt 100% warranted. But when you levy those critiques, for all intensive purposes, it's empty air. Because when you tell an indoctrinated person that they're indoctrinated, the only response that you will get is a resounding nah. All of the response videos and videos talking about them tend to delve away from the actual political points that they make and instead engage with the premise of the channel in general, which is not anything wrong, but I think it's less constructive. GSD Nation has built an empire on the premise that you are watching to see what the kids say. So saying that it's bad to have the kids doing these things will not amount to anything. So instead, I'm going to take it directly to them. I'm going to address claims that they make and show evidence and reasons as to why I disagree. And instead of talking about Matt Morstad and his kids. I'm going to instead talk about the things that they say. And we'll see whether their response is sort of similar to the responses on the other videos. I mean, I doubt that's going to happen. They're much bigger than I am, but yet to be seen. Oh yeah, by the way, roll the clip of them saying that they're indoctrinated with good values. I think that clip is really funny, and it just illustrates my point perfectly. There's no way, preaching that this is happening to them is not going to get anywhere, you know? Anyway, as usual, all of the videos that I reference will be linked in the description. All of my sources for the evidence that I provide will also be linked in the description, so if you want to do any of your own research, you can go ahead and do that. So without a doubt, let's get to work.
We'll all go down to Dixie, away, away. Each Dixie boy must understand that he must mind his Uncle Sam. Away, 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 away. We'll all go down to Dixie.
GSD Nation, by their own admission, takes a no bullshit approach to politics and political commentary. Most famously, you may know them from the Nickelodeon series Kids Pick the President, in case any of you full-grown adults that watch my channel have tuned into that. However, if you've come across them, it's most likely been on Instagram through their I'm a Conservative Kid series.
I'm a conservative kid. Of course I use the bathroom based on how I was born.
So we're gonna roll a clip of that right now. These videos are perplexing because in between the radical pro-MAGA political claims they make, they also sprinkle in a degree of common sense banalities that essentially amount to nothing, to more easily get people on their side. So the question remains, where do their actual political stances lie? Well, luckily for us, they've recently uploaded a video where they graded the first year of Trump 2.0. I think this video is a pretty good indication into everything that I want to talk about, so we're going to be looking at this video primarily, and then afterwards I'll get into a lot more of their short form content and a lot of the stuff that they make unnuanced claims about. I wanted to specifically address one of their long form videos because I understand with the nature of short form content, it's hard to explain yourself. A lot of the time you're doing it for entertainment, and so there's obviously going to be a lack of some nuance in those things. However, I believe with the longer form videos, this would provide them a good opportunity for them to reason their claims and for them to outline why they believe the things that they do. So this video features Matt Morstad and his son Will Morstad grading the first term of Trump 2.0, which I already fucking mentioned. So they came up with 5 categories and awarded 5 grades to evaluate whether they were right in voting for Trump and to see whether he's lived up to the promises that he made during his campaign trail. Let me get up those 5 categories. The 5 categories they evaluated are the economy, legislative success, domestic relations, foreign relations, and security. Right off the bat, you might notice that a lot of these categories are very, very similar. Security and domestic relations are borderline synonymous. Security is also made up of both domestic security and international security. So I think when you talk about domestic relations, international relations, security naturally comes into that. Legislative success could also mean a number of things. Are we talking about the quality of the legislation passed, the amount of legislation passed, the percentage of his legislation that's been approved? There's no real distinction between these things, and I think you find a lot of that as a lot of points that they make across categories end up overlapping. I think that overlap is really critical in our analysis of these videos because it essentially shows that there are only a couple points that they can really make, and so they use these categories as a way of saying, oh, well, you know, he's good on this, he's good on this, he's good on this, when he's really only good on one thing, if that. Now, as you might have guessed, as decently far-right Republicans, both of these guys are Trump apologists. So you have to account for a degree of bias in what they say. However, luckily, we have a couple sources here that I'm going to bring up that I think will shed light on a few of the issues that they talk about. Regardless, we can take a look at the letter grades that they have awarded to Trump, and then we can compare with our own evidence and our own assessment of Trump's first term, and evaluate how good their evaluation is. That doesn't... I said evaluate 2 times. I'm going to keep it in. I don't care.
Foreign relations, we gave him like roughly an A- to an A, somewhere in there, right? Because I do think, well, he's done pretty well, I'd say.
Foreign relations, A- to A.
Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He hath loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on.
To quote Matt Morstad, you can't really dispute the 6 or 7 wars he has ended. 6, 7. Don't worry, that is not the only surprising quote in this, because we have some gold ones from his son about Ukraine that we'll be getting to later. But let's start with the biggest thing from Trump's presidency that affects international relations, being tariffs. We'll be coming back to tariffs a lot because this is the biggest thing that Trump has done that affects both the economy and his foreign relations. But I wanted to talk about not the way that tariffs affect American citizens fiscally, but more that the way tariffs affect international diplomacy. Alright, I have to read some stuff now. In an article published by the Hinrich Foundation, Frederick Bastiat concluded that the positive interactions gained from free trade are integral to stopping international conflict. Anyone who's watched The West Wing, repeat after me, free trade stops wars. So immediately, it seems counterintuitive to say that Trump is good on international relations when he's restricting free trade. Furthermore, Patrick J. McDonald from the University of Texas did a study to analyze the relationship between dyad trade relations across the period of 1960 to the 2000s. I think we can both agree that Trump's trade tariffs are a tool of protectionism. They serve to limit free trade. The study found that the countries within the bottom 10% of protectionism, aka the countries with the freest trade, were 70% less likely to engage in foreign conflict either as an oppressor or as a target than those in the top 10%. So in essence, by restricting free trade and introducing protectionism, Trump has made the country more likely to be involved in new wars. We can actually talk about new wars, however, because I think that's important to international relations, as Trump's most ambitious ticket promise when he was campaigning was that under his watch, there would be no new wars. Here's a quote from Reason on why Venezuela is happening right now. On the campaign trail, Trump signaled that he wanted a full-on war against drug cartels in Latin America. White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller originally wanted to target Mexican cartels, but the Secretary of State Marco Rubio steered Trump towards a regime change campaign in Venezuela, arguing that the Venezuelan government was itself a drug smuggling gang. So that's pretty antithetical to no new wars. But we can also take a look at the wars that these guys claim Trump has ended. I've already written a little bit about this when I talked about his Nobel Peace Prize. So I'm going to briefly run down, because they do mention the classic 8 wars that they presume Trump has ended. So I'm going to quickly run down each of those and give a bit more context to either how he has or how he hasn't ended those, and outline how they're currently progressing. The first major one is Thailand and Cambodia. The actual peace talks to end this war were done in Malaysia with the Malaysian government. Trump only threatened the American involvement over Truth Social. Experts believe that Trump's sort of transactional nature of peace talks has not removed any underlying tensions in the region, and that it's a temporary fix at best. Kosovo and Serbia is another one. When White House officials were prompted to show proof of a resolution, all that they could point to was an economic normalization talk that happened back in 2020. As for the DRC and Rwanda, these peace talks were actually made in 2024. And the recent signing at the White House was only for the people to acknowledge that they would honor those peace talks. However, the Rwandan rebel group M23 was not present, does not consider the peace agreement legally binding, and doesn't acknowledge it whatsoever. For Israel and Iran, this war is definitely not over. This conflict is not over. Israel's still trying to find military action in Lebanon and Yemen, and Iran is firmly allied with Palestine, so there's a temporary ceasefire, but again, I wouldn't call that a brokered peace agreement. Pakistan and India. Trump's negotiations managed to last an entire night because the next day after the peace associations, both countries accused each other of violating it. It wasn't until Indian Foreign Affairs Minister Subramanian Jaishankar actually got involved and worked out a hold on military action. For Egypt and Ethiopia, there was a dispute over the foreign labor at the GERD, and that sort of broke down, and no real resolution has been reached with regards to that. Credit where credit's due. From what I can gather, he actually did fully put the brakes on Armenia and Azerbaijan. And then finally, Israel and Palestine. Nope, didn't fix that one. So currently we're looking at a very generous maybe 1.5. out of A. But we have to also address the conflicts that Trump made worse, because that is a thing that he did. Due to the temporary ceasefire in 2025, the Houthi movement in Yemen stopped its attacks on boats in the Red Sea. However, in March of 2025, Trump attacked Yemen, carrying out 2 months of non-specific bombing, and then seemingly just stopped and got bored. Furthermore, Trump has increased bombing on Somalia more than any US president in history, enacting 118 air raids in his first year. Experts are now estimating that he's projected to bomb Somalia more than Obama and Bush and Biden combined. US Army generals have bragged about the airstrikes on Somalia as well, saying that it was the biggest airstrike on Somalian soil that the world had ever seen, the one that happened in February last year. But the biggest issue with him is with Russia, and both of these guys admit it. Trump hasn't leveraged his huge network with Russian officials to end the war, and it's now gotten to the point where Will Morstad is saying that Ukraine has to kowtow to Russia or be completely wiped off the map. Quote, "Any request Russia offers for peace, they should probably take," referring to Ukraine. "They are a cockroach compared to Russia." Is comply or die the rhetoric that you guys are going to stand behind? So in my opinion, I wouldn't call that an A- to an A on international relations. I'd actually call that really bad. I'd probably call that a D- to an F, but let's move on to the other categories and see if their evaluation gets any better.
Legislative success, we gave him a B- because even though he does currently hold the majority, he hasn't passed as many bills as we would have liked him to pass. And judging
especially given the majority that they have.
Yeah, also judging how the midterms are looking, looks like he might lose.
Legislative success, they gave him a B-. When they talk about legislative success, GSD doesn't really say anything about the quality of the legislation passed. It's definitely more of a quantity issue that they're referring to. They also bring up the government shutdown, which, as much as I loathe Republicans for not extending the subsidies for SNAP, fuck Chuck Schumer. Really, fuck Chuck Schumer. He has such a good habit of snatching defeat in the hands of victory. Will Morstad, by the way, again makes it known that he believes the government shutdown was good because all of those unnecessary government employees stopped getting paid. Obviously, when we talk about legislation in the Trump administration, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act is the main point of cause, and I will talk about this later. I'm just going to leave that a little bit till we get to the economy. The first shutdown, however, was about extending the votes on the Affordable Care Act to December. That's what eventuated, is that the vote for the Affordable Care Act subsidies being extended was pushed to September. The GOP did not want to extend those subsidies, and by proxy is trying to make healthcare less affordable in a country that already has a healthcare crisis. The ACA, by the way, dropped the percentage of uninsured people from 16% at its highest across the nation to a record low of 7.7% since its inception. And the GOP decided that they didn't want to extend the subsidies for the ACA that expired in November. Furthermore, as of the time that I'm recording this, there are talks of the government going back into shutdown because Democrats are trying to block a bill that gives more funding to the DHS. Democrats, rightly so, are pushing for a higher standard of quality control, more use of judicial warrants for ICE agents, and essentially having a budget crackdown on the Department of Homeland Security. Obviously, the GOP are opposed to this because they want ICE to run around completely uninhibited, so there's a high chance the government goes back into shutdown. As far as legislative success goes, he definitely did pass the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, so if we're going on, yeah, he did that, right? There we go. If we're talking about shutdown, he definitely also had a shutdown that led to 900,000 employees being furloughed and cost the government $11 billion, which, by the way, is on top of the 2 shutdowns in his first run as presidency that cost the government at minimum $5 billion because the initial shutdown has not been tabulated correctly yet. On top of that, the prospective upcoming shutdown, which is sure to cost the government even more. Also, voter ID laws are really dumb. Can we just not? With that, voter fraud... Voter ID is literally a non-issue. All it does for the GOP is stop people who would traditionally vote Democrat from voting, people of poor communities who have never had to travel or have a car, and people of diaspora. If you argue that it stops cases of voter fraud, I guess all 5 people that have done it might be stopped by voter ID laws, because we have data for this, by the way. The National Academy of Sciences concluded that there was no evidence for systemic voter fraud in the US currently. Not only that, we have this table that shows the percentage of voter fraud across US elections for a group of states, all of which amount to less than 0.1% each year. Yeah, so you can look, hold up, I'm looking right now. Yeah, so 13 years of election in Nevada, 8 reported cases of voter fraud. Incredible. You guys really need to crack down on that. Percentage of fraud, here you go, at the end, percentage of fraudulent votes. In Nevada, 0.0000940. Yeah, so legislative success, I would argue, is an F, for reasons, especially about the OBBBA, that we'll come to later.
Security, we gave him an A. That's pretty good, I'd say.
Yeah.
Right? 95%.
Security, they gave an A. So let's address that. Once again, Will Morstad makes it known that people exercising their right to peaceful protest is something that he would rather not happen. He argues that said peaceful protest is inhibiting Trump's ability to secure the state. Quote, "It would be better if ICE protesters weren't protesting." I'm sure the US government didn't want the SDS to protest the Vietnam War, but nevertheless. They talk a little bit about, for security, the elimination of foreign threats like Iran, but I think we went over that decently enough back in foreign relations, so we'll park that for now. And let's focus on the domestic side of security that we haven't come around to yet. One of the points that they make is that ICE has done a great job deporting illegal immigrants and criminals. But thanks to the Transactional Records Access Clearinghouse, we can get a broader picture on just how safe ICE is making America. If we're talking about security, by the way, simply being an undocumented immigrant doesn't affect security. It's actually criminals that do that. So, yeah, by the way, undocumented immigrants in terms of spending power held $299 billion worth of spending power in 2023. So, also for the record, undocumented immigrants commit crimes at a lower rate than US-born citizens, according to a report from the NIJ. Conservatives believe that deporting undocumented workers is good for security, but in reality, stopping criminals is good for security. Either way, out of the 70,000 people currently detained by ICE, 74% have no previous criminal convictions. Therefore, in my opinion, no reason to be held. Furthermore, the ICE alternative to detention is keeping over 180,000 families under government surveillance at the minute. The reason why there are so many undocumented people within the US is because there are currently 2.3 million immigrants whose application for asylum is on backlog, and over 3 million court hearings about asylum on backlog. Only a quarter of immigrants that are removed from the United States pending a court case are represented by lawyers in said court, in a clear violation of due process, right? Of those cases, 60% were charged only with entry without inspection. And lastly, last year, only 50% of detainees were convicted of immigration offenses. As a US citizen, you should be scared of ICE. More than 170 US citizens were held or detained in raids whilst exercising their right to protest. Furthermore, 20 of those people who were detained were not given a right to contact a lawyer. Again, in direct violation of due process. ICE agents tackled a 79-year-old car wash owner and broke multiple of his ribs. They then denied him medical attention for 12 hours. They pepper sprayed and beat up a man who was filming them searching for his relative, as well as pulled a gun on him. Border Patrol Chief Gregory Bravino admits that ICE racially profiles people when assessing who they're going after, citing one of the criteria as how people look compared to you. Even more frightening, 6 people have died in ICE detention centers in January this year alone, one of those cases being ruled a homicide. Mr. Lunas Campos died from asphyxia due to neck and torso compression after 5 officers restrained him and 1 officer sat on top of his back. The Department of Homeland Security falsely claimed that this was attempted suicide. Furthermore, ICE agents also fatally shot Renee Good and Alex Preddy, one for trying to flee an unconstitutional arrest, and the other for trying to stop federal agents from beating a woman to death. The officer who shot Renee Good was in direct violation of his training and protocol when approaching the vehicle from the front, and used excessive force. 2 of the shots that killed her were from the side of the car. And for those of you who argue that Preddy shouldn't have had a weapon on him, which, by the way, Second Amendment rights, but for those of you who argue that he shouldn't have come to a protest with a loaded armament, you were very on the other side of the spectrum when Christopher Albers brought his semi-automatic pistol to the insurrection riots of January 6th. They like to talk about Obama and his deportation stats, saying more people died in ICE detention under Obama, but that's simply not true. This is a report by the NIJC. The number of 56 deaths under Obama is not entirely correct. The figure of 56 deaths comes from a 2016 report, Fatal Neglect, How ICE Ignores Immigration Deaths in Detention, but the report covers only through early 2016 before Obama's final year in office, which ended only at the beginning of 2017. According to a list from ICE, a total of 67 detainees died during Obama's 8 years of presidency. The number of deaths in ICE custody are already higher under Trump, as the infographic below shows. So far, the count is at 83 deaths. So Trump hasn't even completed his 2 terms yet. Already he's outpacing Obama in deaths in ICE detention centers. Furthermore, Obama did deport way higher numbers than Trump, but he had a 90% deportation rate of foreign undocumented nationals, whereas Trump's sits just below 70% as far as I'm aware. And if we're talking about security on the topic of January 6th, Trump pardoned over 1,500 protesters, 600 of which were charged with assaulting a police officer, and 175 of which were charged with discharging a deadly weapon or causing grievous bodily harm to an officer. The last thing I'm going to bring up that they address is that they talk about blue cities, and blue cities having higher crime rates or rates of undocumented immigrants. What they fail to mention is that red states have higher rates of violent crime and murder when compared to blue states, according to a report published by the Manhattan Institute. Yeah, so he should get nothing short of an F for security, really. He is, as Mehdi Hassan said, he is soft on crime and soft on criminals.
Domestic relations, I gave him a D because he's very direct, almost too direct, which is sadly not always the best thing.
Domestic relations, they gave him a D. Credit where credit is due. They actually acknowledge that Trump has a dismal approval rating and a huge propensity to use ad hominem attacks when talking to people he disagrees with.
You know, it's not the question that I mind, it's your attitude. I think you are a terrible reporter.
The people of Georgia are angry. Quiet.
Mr. President.
I'll tell you what, CNN should be ashamed of itself having you working for them.
And these numbers are going to be repeated on Monday night, along with others that we're going to have by that time, which are much more substantially. But
You are a rude, terrible person. You shouldn't be working for CNN. Go ahead.
I think that's unfair.
You're a very rude person.
Father Matt Morstad actually saying his rhetoric is not very presidential, which I completely agree with. The way he treats his staff, and more specifically the way he treats reporters, is not befitting of a leader of the free world. It's not. Play the piggy clip. Trump is currently sitting at 38% approval, a dismally low stat, and one that's so bad, Gallup announced that they're considering not doing presidential approval polls anymore. They killed the Gallup approval poll. Furthermore, 80% of US citizens at the minute view the country as more divided than united. They also, and again, credit where credit's due, they call him out for his despicable remarks about Rob Reiner. I disagree on them a couple points, saying that firing Elon was a bad idea, because Elon has absolutely no experience outside being an unfunny Reddit-pilled moron. But I do agree with them that what he said about Rob Reiner was absolutely a no-go. They do, however, make the claim that DOGE, the Budget Committee, was a hard loss due to them finding $1 billion a day in waste, but NPR blatantly proved this wrong. So I don't think that that's something that we can agree on. So here's a quote from NPR. In Tuesday's update, Doge's new grand total is 65 billion saved. It's unclear how that tally was achieved. The site added almost 1,200 new receipts that claim to show another 4 billion in savings, but when NPR matched the... Oh, fuck. Wow, I'm gonna do this whole quote again. In Tuesday's update, Doge's new... No one gets free advertising. Oh my god, fuck off! Bring back skippable ads. Bring back skippable ads, please. Here's a quote from NPR. In Tuesday's update, Doge's new grand total is 65 billion saved. It's unclear how that tally was achieved. The site added almost 1,200 new receipts that claim to show another 4 billion in savings found. But when NPR matched the claims to federal contracting data, the savings were essentially unchanged from the initial analysis, now at 2.3 billion. They brought up Doge and government spending, and so I think this is a nice way for us to segue into the most important one, the economy.
Right.
And then economy, we gave him an A-, because overall, like, you know, inflation's down and like gas prices are down and basically everything that you just said. So yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Matt Morstad makes a lot of claims in this section about what is up and what is down, and so I'm going to address those first. Then I'm going to talk about some other things in the economy, and then I'm going to get to the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So that's the sequence of events. Our first quote from Matt Morstad is, "The stock market has done well." So Trump's tariff policies are probably the biggest economic blunder he has made. We saw this before with Herbert Hoover. Let me check, it is Herbert Hoover. When Herbert Hoover, in an effort to create more American jobs, introduced tariffs that drastically worsened the Great Depression, and FDR had to come in and sign the New Deal to save it. But I just want you to warn you that tariffs will be coming up basically ad nauseum over this section because they're the biggest thing that affects the economy that Trump has done. We can start with his effort to increase domestic manufacturing through tariffs. The US Wealth Management Service reported that his tariff policy dropped the S&P 500 20% in 7 weeks. Even so, in terms of percentage growth of the S&P 500, he is doing worse than every other president over the same time frame. While the S&P 500 has rebounded, that's not the only index in America. The Dow Jones Industrial Average across presidential term lengths is shown in this graph from microtrends.net, which illustrates that his growth has been lower than a large degree of other presidents. First, we'll show it compared to Obama, on which he is lower. Then we'll show it in comparison to Bill Clinton, of which he is lower. And finally, we'll do it in comparison to himself, of which he is lower. So the S&P 500 and the Dow Jones are up, but so far he's falling short compared to other presidents in terms of percentage gain. Other presidents, including his first term. We can go a little bit more specific though, and actually assess where that economic growth is coming in. The biggest winner of Trump's stock market growth is without a doubt defense contractors. I think we all knew that. For someone who claimed no new wars, defense contractors seem to be doing incredibly well as he, does political coups in Venezuela and tries to start arming troops to invade Greenland, as well as sending a lot of money to Israel. Defense stocks are skyrocketing. The next claim Matt Morstad makes is that inflation is down. Yes, and no. According to Euronews, inflation has cooled off from the Biden COVID spike, but it still sits around 0.7% above the Federal Reserve projected target of 2% each year. Headline inflation is around 2.7% and core inflation is around 2.6%. There's also a month-to-month increase of around 0.3% in headline inflation and 0.2% in core inflation. While yes, the post-COVID inflation boom has stabilized, hard for me to credit this entirely to Trump because I think this is a product of the world getting back to normal. In essence, the fact that the core inflation and the headline inflation have increased relatively similarly month to month, and the fact that they're sitting around the same amount is indicative of, across the board, prices are steadily on the rise. Headline inflation is different from core inflation, by the way, as core inflation is calculated without food and fuel included, two of the most volatile markets in America. The fact that headline and core inflation are within 0.1% of each other shows that prices are increasing across the board. Gas prices are down. Trump's claim that gas prices are down since the beginning of the Biden administration is correct. And Trump's claim that gas prices are down during his term is also correct. However, the magnitude of difference between these two claims is not something that should be understated. Since 2022, gas prices have dropped from an estimated $5 per gallon to just under $3, a drop of about 40%. However, when you compare that to the drop from when Trump actually started his term to now, the drop is only around 0.5%, which means a large degree of that came at the end of Biden's presidential term. Furthermore, while gas prices are down, electricity prices are up nearly $2 per kilowatt hour from 15 to 17, and car prices have gone up by 4% this year, 2% higher than the expected 2% increase. So gas might be down, but all of the other things that go into buying a car are not. He claims rent prices are down. This one, I think is counterproductive to argue because that is sort of managed on a state and local level. I don't think Trump really has much of a say in that, and I could be wrong about that. I think that's more credit to local elected officials, especially Democratic Socialist Zoran Mamdani putting in his rent freeze plan. So, but regardless, I think that's more of a non-issue. He argues that GDP is up, and again, yes and no. Real GDP is up from what experts call a tumultuous year, which is surprising until you look at what is actually putting that GDP up. Yes, a portion of that is household consumers, but a huge portion of that, making up an estimated 70%, is because of the AI bubble and investment in the absolute cesspit that is generative AI. Eventually this will burst and I think lead to huge economic downturn. So, alright, now that we've addressed their points, let's move on to the points about Trump's economy and a lot of his campaign promises that they conveniently left out. In the first year of Trump 2.0, the incumbent president has managed to create just shy of 500,000 jobs. If his rate of job creation stays steady, he's projected to create just over 2 million jobs for the people of America by the end of his tenure. In comparison, Obama managed to create 11 million jobs over his second term alone. That's nearly 6 times as much as President Trump has projected. Furthermore, apart from a recent dip from 4.5% to 4.4%, unemployment has been on a steady increase. And despite his attempts at job growth through his tariff policy and bringing domestic manufacturing back to the US, for the first time since April 2021, job seekers outnumber the amount of open positions in America. So even if everyone wanted to and could get a job, there are not enough positions to employ everyone in the country. Also, yikes, consumer sentiment has dropped to its lowest point since 2014 due to the softening job market and anxieties over foreign influences, which tie back to tariffs. Say it with me, free trade is important. Let's move on to groceries because this was a big one. We can actually quote Trump saying that in his campaign, he would bring down grocery prices from day one. Right? He would lower grocery prices. Well, the 2025 report from the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows a very different story. Grocery prices have risen 2.7% in his first year, in line with headline inflation, but certain consumer products have shown an absolutely enormous increase in price. I'm sure it was a mistake on your guys' end. You planned to talk about groceries, so I'm going to let that one go. But you, Matt Morstad, I imagine, like most Americans, enjoy a cup of coffee with your breakfast. Well, under Trump 2.0, you're paying nearly 20% more for that cup of coffee. Ground beef has risen up nearly 15% as well, and bananas have increased in price by nearly 7%. Huge jumps in the price of consumer product. Furthermore, apart from a slight dip in April 2025, the rate at which prices have been going up has increased every month. David Ortega, a food economics expert, told the BBC that the US president has very little control over the price of groceries. However, in reality, we can see that that's demonstrably false. Most of the coffee imported to the United States comes from Brazil. Brazil, who are the new owners of a shiny, sparkly 50% trade tariff. Furthermore, a large degree of his ICE crackdowns have left domestic farms without employees, as an estimated 40% of farm workers are undocumented immigrants, which would also contribute to price increases for farmed goods. Here we go. The OBBBA, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. This is where we start to move beyond the realm of day-to-day price checks on consumer goods and get into the slightly scary, more broad topic of macroeconomics. We need to address the implications of these tax cuts and what will happen to the national debt as a result of the bill. Once again, I understand that your staff is mostly children, and for the benefit of them and my audience, we'll clear a few things up. A deficit is the amount by which government spending exceeds its revenue over the period of a year. The accumulation of a deficit every fiscal year leads to what we call the national debt. It's a basic fact that a large deficit means the government has to borrow more, which leads to an increase in national debt. Through basic cause and effect, I'm sure you and I are aware that when the debt increases, someone has to pay for it. This usually comes in the forms of increased interest rates, specifically on things like mortgages or cars, which prices people out of owning homes, potential tax hikes that have to come in, although we've already established that Trump is opposed to that, and a reduction of funding for public services. Essentially, as a consumer, an increased deficit takes money out of your pocket. Furthermore, increased government borrowing leads to crowding, reducing the capacity for private investment and leading to economic downturn under capitalism. This will also lead to the transitioning of global capital, as economists believe that capital will flow where it's the most unrestricted. And if the US increases its crowding, globalization is going to let it move to a place where it can get the highest return, which is most likely going to be China. If all of these systems is something that we can agree on, which it should be, as it's pretty standard economics. I'm not an economist, and I managed to get this through a couple hours of research. Then how can you argue adding $4.1 trillion to the deficit over the next decade is a good thing? Because that's what the OBBBA is going to add. It's going to add $4.1 trillion to the national deficit. Economists project that this will cause the national debt to increase over $53 trillion by 2034, right when I imagine your children are going to graduate college and join the workforce. It's shown that the top percentage of earners are getting away with this scot-free. The Congressional Budget Office found that through this adding to the deficit, as well as the reduced funding for SNAP and Medicaid, will disproportionately affect the two lowest bands of income when compared to the highest. We can actually, I'll put the graph up now, right? You can see the disparity between the highest earners and even the next 9 categories of earners. The highest earners benefit from this so disproportionately hugely. The CBO effectively found that for the lowest income earners, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act will be taking $1,000 out of their pocket, effectively. And for the highest earners, they'll be earning an extra effective 14 grand. This claim, by the way, is further corroborated by the Tax Policy Center and the Budget Lab at Yale. So this isn't just one institution, this is decently well evidenced. In one of your short-form content videos, you claim that you want to give poor people a hand up, not a handout. And all I'm arguing is that taking an effective grand out of their pocket and adding $53 trillion to the national debt is not doing that. It seems like what you actually like is padding the pockets of rich conservatives. Furthermore, JP Morgan, a company that by all accounts should be hell-bent on maintaining Trump's agenda because of the fact that their CEOs want to make more money, still had this to say regarding the OBBBA. Bottom line is that even with the additional revenue from tariffs, US deficits will likely increase above the 6% of GDP. The deficit expansion, and thus stimulus, is also front-loaded, most impactful in 2027. After the 2028 elections, more spending cuts kick in and the deficit expansion narrows. Furthermore, and this is what's most important, this will cause the US debt to GDP ratio to rise from 98% last year to 129% in 2034. The debt will be at a higher proportion than the GDP. The plan was that a short-term stimulus would raise the GDP a little, but it has huge long-term downsides for the consumer, especially for those in the lower class. By the way, JP Morgan also admits that all of that benefit is predicated on the tariffs remaining in place, which, if Democrats are projected to win the House in the midterm like they are, may not happen. Anyway, in conclusion to this part of the video, we agree on domestic relations, but we don't agree on much else. In the face of the evidence that I presented, I don't know how you could come to the conclusion that Trump deserves a B+ overall. I would say that he deserves an F. Being generous, a D-, but I think his antagonism towards free speech, the right to protest, democracy in general, is just something that can't be overlooked, and his economic impacts compound his negative attacks on justice. Alright, let's get into some of the more lighter-hearted stuff. like their short form content. Here's one on taxes. This video shows Father Matt Morstad teaching both of his kids about the reality of tax. Apart from the fact he doesn't actually teach his kids about the reality of tax, he just takes half of their Halloween candy. As a visual, he takes about half of the kids' candy for what he calls income tax. Scary visual. Definitely. But using the Smart Asset income tax calculator, we can calculate that to have an effective tax rate of 50%, you would have to be earning over $2.5 million. And frankly, I wouldn't be complaining if that's how much I'm earning. I'm still a millionaire in liquid assets at that point. He also forgets to mention that those hypothetical taxes pay for the refurbishments of roads, the police force, and the military that they're so fond of. If this was an apt analogy, with Father Matt Morstad playing the government, and the kids playing tax-paying citizens, play out slightly differently. Once the kids have earned their candy, and been effectively taxed on it, they'd then have to watch Father Matt Morstad give all of their candy to the neighbor's kid, who is popular for bullying other children and stealing their lunches. All of this is to say he didn't share the realities of tax. There's a lot more nuance than that. I don't care if this is a joke video, it didn't happen. This is where we get into a little bit more culture war stuff, and I am trying to avoid that because I don't, like, it's not helpful. But they do talk about race, they do talk about, they're very fond of Turning Point USA. So I think I do have to address this, at least in some capacity.
They call him a racist, right? Which is always what they call him. Racist, sexist, bigot, homophobe, transphobe, xenophobe, all those. So whenever people try to say, oh, he's a racist, oh, I'm like, you don't know the man.
The media company Zateo, which, by the way, is run by my fucking personal hero, Mehdi Hassan. I've quoted him once this video already, but he's incredible. They have an article called Charlie Kirk in His Own Words, and that is what I'm going to be using for the basis of this argument. On civil rights, quote, "We made a huge mistake when we passed the Civil Rights Act in the mid-1960s. What a start. By the way, the Civil Rights Act outlaws discrimination based on race, sex, and gender identity. It also prohibits segregation in public places. MAGA, conservative, right-wingers, whatever you want to say, they're so quick to jump on this bandwagon that people are discriminated against for being straight and for being white. Tom MacDonald, in a lot of his songs, says, like, don't hate me because I'm white or whatever. But then they go out and say stuff like this, where they're like, we want to dismantle the Civil Rights Act and bring back discrimination. So, I don't know. Seems a bit hypocritical to me. Here's a couple quotes of Charlie Kirk on black people. Happening all the time in urban America, prowling blacks go around for fun. They go to target white people. That's a fact. It's happening more and more. That's not a fact. If I see a black pilot, I'm gonna be like, boy, I hope he's qualified. They're coming out and they're saying, I'm only here because of affirmative action. Yeah, we know. You do not have the brain processing power to otherwise be taken seriously. You had to go steal a white person's slot to be taken somewhat seriously. That's on black women. He's also very fond of Muslims, saying, they aren't even hiding their intentions. Muslims plan to conquer Europe by demographic replacement. Will Europe wake up in time? Demographic replacement theory is a conspiracy theory and is not true by any reasonable metric. So, there we go. It's harmful to peddle that. On Palestine, he said, I don't think that place exists. And on transgender people, he said, you're an abomination to God. I could really go to town here commenting on how abhorrent all of this is. And I think especially telling your kids to align with this sort of stuff. But I think I'm just going to let it sit here with the fact that these people are coming out and saying you didn't know him, he wasn't racist. Secondly, the section of TPUSA that they talk about that reaches out to minority communities is called TPUSA Rise, which is a much, much, much smaller part of the greater Turning Point USA organization. It's really hard right now to find any information on Rise, because every time you try to look up TPUSA at the minute, it's concerned with their god-awful halftime show. But from what I understand, it's a way of peddling those same traditional family values into minority communities. Which, if they don't believe in DEI, I don't know why they have TPUSA Rise. That's sort of arguing that TPUSA, the main one, isn't for everyone, isn't it? I digress. It's less detailed, it's given less importance, it's barely mentioned, which is no surprise because a lot of the people in TPUSA view minorities and immigrants as less than. I've been really negative today, so I want to end this on a high note and illustrate some of their videos that I actually find funny. I'm going to preface they're incredibly few and far between, but nevertheless I do want to actually bring attention to ones that I like. I can't tell if this is ironic or not, but on the off chance that they're serious about it, incredibly funny. That's it, by the way. That's the only one. That's the only one of theirs that I found funny. A stupid shit post that's obviously meant to be taken ironically. That's the only one that I could find.
If you make me president, I can free all the slaves. 2 years later, I'll get shot. And baby, when you call me, you can call me a...
In all seriousness, don't do this. Like, don't put your kids up to this. Especially when there's a very surface level understanding of how a lot of these things work. I'm not saying that mine is much deeper, but I at least have bits of evidence that show why I think these things are bad. The claim that X is up, Y is up, he's stopped this, he's stopped that, in bold opposition to things that you can find from simple Googling. Like, I'm not a good investigative journalist. I just have a computer. There isn't much more to be said about this because, I mean, they're not going to, like, stop what's going on. And so, eventually the kids will get to the age where it's, like, okay to be commenting on political stuff like this. But I hope this is, provided as a little fact file that you can use in case anyone does send you one of their videos or makes you try to look at their stuff from a position other than complete irony. I think leave it to the adults, I think is the message. Yeah, leave it to the adults. Oh, by the way, just while I remember, they platformed a guy who said Hitler was misunderstood, and play the fucking reaction clip to that, because that was the funniest shit I've ever seen, by the way.
I think he is a misjudged figure in history, to be honest.
Interesting.
I do.
Wow.
Do you still think he's like bad though because World War II and
yeah, I
all
don't
that
think he
stuff?
necessarily caused World War II 100%. I think history is very. I don't.
Alright, welcome to the end. Welcome to the end of the video. Thank you. Thank you for watching. I have no doubt that this is going to get a lot of negative attention. If my last anti-MAGA video is anything to go by, the RFK video, a lot of people do not like it when I come out against MAGA, which is crazy. Crazy, by the way. But yeah, again, thank you. Read my blog. I'm starting to do a lot more election coverage, transitioning to a little bit more serious political stuff. So, provided that stuff ends up going well, there's a chance that I end up doing, live election coverage in November once the primaries are done and the actual races start for the House and the Senate. So I believe that's really important. So if you want to see that, let me know. But yeah, thank you guys. Thank you again. And seriously, don't send hate to GSD Nation. I want to preface this. Don't do that. This video is meant as a shit. Just I don't know. This video is meant purely as an engagement in political ideology, not as a means of attacking them as a people. So just take it easy. Be really chill. All right. Okay. Cool. Read my blog. That's the end goal. Read my blog. That's the end.